Welcome, and thank you for joining us today for Managing Networks in the Age of Cloud, SDN, and Big Data, Network Management Megatrends 2014. My name is Raleigh Gould, and I will be your moderator for today's event. Our featured speakers are Enterprise Management Associates, VP of Research, Jim Frey, and Enterprise Management Associates Principal Research Analyst, Tracy Corbo. Jim has over 25 years of experience in the computing industry, with the last 20 of those years spent in network management, straddling both enterprise and service provider sectors. Tracy has 24 years of experience in the computing industry. At EMA, Tracy works in the network management practice area. And before I hand things over to today's featured speakers, I did want today's audience to know that Jim and Tracy will be taking your questions at the conclusion of today's event, so I do encourage you to log your questions at any time throughout the course of the presentation by using your Q&A functionality. Also, today's event is being recorded, and you will receive a follow-up email from Enterprise Management Associates tomorrow that will include the on-demand version, as well as some additional resources. And now I'd like to go ahead and turn things over to our featured speakers. Starting with you, Jim.
Thank you, Raleigh, and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us. We have a lot of information to share with you, and I want to first start by thanking our sponsors, shown here, who made this project possible and allowed us to go out and collect the data that we're going to share with you here today. So we want to talk about what we were doing with this study, the motivation behind it, sort of put some context around the process, and then we're going to get right into the results. And the results we've got into just sort of a couple of groups of areas here. One is setting the stage of the context of current network management practices and operations. Then we're going to look at some megatrends, some major shifts that we see based on what we see in the industry as well as what we saw in the results of the data. And then we'll sort of end talking about how there's some emerging changes, slow evolution in network management itself, and how that can translate into some requirements that everyone should be thinking about when they go out and look at network management tools. And then we'll wrap up with Q&A. So let's get right into it. First of all, I want to start by making sure everyone understands what we were trying to do with this particular study. We're definitely trying to keep on top of, and we've been doing this for some time, the underlying shifts, the sort of macro trends that have an effect on the network management tools and technologies and practices, mostly within enterprise and government settings. This is the third such report we've done since I've been with EMA. First one was in 2008. We refreshed that in 2012. And now we are in 2014 with another update. A little bit of look on the side to the right there of who participated. The way we do this research is we reach out to practitioners. We ask them a bunch of questions about what's affecting them and what their current experiences have been. And we had, in this case, 246 participants who contributed to the research. Good mix of line-type contributors as well as management chain. Pretty even mix between those two groups. Good mix of organization sizes. So we always look at this by trying to seed various different size of organizations by number of employees. You're going to see us take another different look at the data we have here too, which is by size of managed environment. We'll talk about that in a minute. We did include geographic representation outside of North America. About a quarter of the respondents were from Europe and Middle East and Africa, EMEA. And then we did have a couple of significant size verticals. There's not much we're going to talk about in the webinar today, but the full report does include some findings we had by special needs that came clear when we looked at just the financial services folks or the manufacturing or healthcare folks. So let's jump into the results here. The first section is sort of taking a snapshot and looking at what is going on in the managed environments for the folks who took part in the survey. And I want to start with what I mentioned a moment ago, which is we decided we should take a look here and make sure we weren't drawing conclusions on size of organization by number of employees, when in reality, many times what changes requirements is actually the size of the managed environment. So what we have here is a little complex. I'm going to try to describe for you, but basically on the vertical axis, we looked at the number of network devices under management, and then we're crossing that and showing the colored bars by the number of employees in the organizations. And you can see there's a pretty normal sort of what you would expect. Smaller organizations employee-wise have smaller number of network devices. But there's some interesting outliers here. In particular, there's a few organizations that reported themselves as medium-sized, but they had a huge number of managed devices. We also similarly had a few very large organizations that had very few network devices under management. So in some of the results we're going to show you, we're going to show some that are more organizational leaning by size of organization, but the ones that are more technically leaning, many of those will show you split by this number of network devices under management. Next, I want to jump right into what I think is one of the most really interesting results that we got. Something that Tracy and I talked to a lot of folks about is, how they deploy their tools. One of the key things they do with them is to try to figure out what's the source of disruptions in network and application performance. And so we asked. So thinking about the last three difficult issues, now there's easy issues. There's things where you can see a device, failed, melted down. You lost connectivity to a critical part of the resource. That's pretty straightforward. What I'm more interested in, and what we were more interested in, is the more difficult, the more subtle problems, the ones that are hard to troubleshoot, the intermittent issues, but the ones that are, can come back to haunt you over and over again. What was at the source of the issue when it finally came down to understanding a root cause? And the answer here from the folks that we talked to was surprisingly and refreshingly honest, I think, which is that they called out network issues, performance congestion, and network configuration changes as the number one and most common root causes. Now, while they did that, the reason, by the way, I say this is refreshing is usually you talk to people, in this case it's a lot of networking-oriented people, they usually will tend to point the finger somewhere else. But they didn't do that here. They pointed the finger to themselves and said, a lot of the root causes have been in the network. But that being said, it's not like anybody else gets off scot-free here. All of the other traditional domains have their plenty of their share of root causes coming from them as well. And I think the takeaway from this is it's pretty balanced. While there continues to need to be a focus on the network to make sure it's doing its piece, you have to be aware that when you get into these hard problems, the source of the issue could absolutely lie anywhere. And so you have to keep that in mind at all times. Next piece of data I want to share, which is really sort of fascinating for us as well. We wanted to figure out how fractured the tools environment was. And so we asked this question: how many tools is the network operations team using for network monitoring and troubleshooting? Now, we split this one by organization size. We could have probably done it by network managed device sizes as well, but it was pretty similar. And the bottom line is this: there's a lot of tools in use. So some of it's biased, as you might expect. Smaller organizations have less tools. So if we look at the average here, the relatively small organizations probably have 3 to 5 types of tools. Medium organizations probably in the 4 to 10 range, and larger, more in the 6 to 15 range. But oh my, some of the outliers are really, really impressive. I did take a peek at the data, by the way, and how this pans out when we looked at the number of devices under management. And the interesting thing there was some folks that reported they have a relatively small managed environment that still had more than 25 tools in place. And similarly, even though you see on this slide here where we have some large organizations by employee number only have 1 or 2 tools, when we looked at it by managed environment size, only one person said in a really large environment where they're using less than 3 tools. So managed environment definitely does change this mix. But the bottom line is there's a lot of tools in use, and it's still a very fractured situation in a lot of shops. Okay, with that aside, let's move into some of the broader initiatives and some of the sort of macro factors that are affecting choices in network management tools and monitoring and managing. Here's a question that we've asked for the last couple of years. In particular, we wanted to know within the networking organization, which networking initiatives are having an impact on priorities in monitoring and managing networks and networked application performance. And I'm not going to go through all of these. Everyone who listens to this will get a copy of the slides. If you're listening to a replay, you can go to our site and get a copy of the slides, and you can go through them in detail. But I just want to highlight the things that I'm pointing out with the arrows here. Number one, network security always ends up top in these kind of analyses. It was in 2012 as well. It was the top answer. The interesting thing, I think, is we're starting to see an ascendance in public hybrid cloud projects. It came in at number 4 a couple of years ago, and now it's up to a pretty solid number 3, although it's pretty close to wireless LAN upgrades in this case. The other thing that's a little bit different here is we had, in 2012, we had a choice that was managing virtual network elements that was not given as a choice here. so it doesn't show up in the top 4 as it did 2 years ago. The last thing I want to point out, down below at the bottom, the last little arrow there, SDN is not a major factor in most places. We've got a lot more on SDN, and Tracy's going to take us through that in a few minutes. Similarly to those initiatives that might be specific to the network, we also try to keep tabs on the broader IT initiatives, because many things are happening outside of the network. Still, in fact, most things that happen outside of the network team still come back and have an impact on the network, because the network has to deliver it all, right? And so we have to keep an eye on both the networking specific and the broader IT initiatives. So a couple things I want to call out on this one. Server virtualization continues to be the big driver, and it just as it was in 2012, it was the top answer. Application performance optimization and data center consolidation came in number 2 and 3. One thing to point out, data center consolidation was most often called out by the large organizations. Not such a big issue for small and medium-sized, because they are starting typically with less or fewer data centers, and therefore there's not much drive for consolidation. But it reached the number 3 point largely because of those reporting from large organizations. A couple of things to point out, some real contrast. As I did with the prior slide, this slide is actually showing you a split of resources between the executives and the staff, and there's some different perceptions. In general, you see in both of the last 2 slides, executives think that everything is more influential than the staff does, in general, with a few minor exceptions. But some places where there's some real difference in perception, a great example is client endpoint mobility, where the executive team is thinking, hey, this is pretty important in our priorities, but the staff is saying, yeah, really not so much. A little bit less contrast, but also interesting in terms of the difference in perception is video conferencing and cross-domain security initiatives. The staff feels like relatively have a better handle on these, but they're all acknowledging to some degree that they do have an impact. One more ground setting or sort of setting the stage issue I want to share here is some focused questions we did around remote connectivity in WAN services. Now, this is only one of several data points that we have in the full report, but one I think that was quite interesting. Now, we asked folks what kind of connectivity that they were using, and we talked about 3 different types. And I've got them listed in the question here: managed services, general internet, and managed internet. And what we mean by that is managed services is, for the most part these days, MPLS. General internet is just your basic ISP type connection with no guaranteed service. But managed internet is optimized business internet, where you're getting onto a groomed high-performance backbone with some sort of service level agreement in place. Typically, companies like Akamai, Ariaka, that sort of company provides a managed internet service. So one of the things you don't see here, we asked a prior question that asked, are you planning on deploying more of these connectivity types in the next year? And the answer was, yeah, pretty much. 40% of people said yes. But then the follow-on question is what you see here, which is, what's the mix look like? Do you see cases where you're replacing managed services, otherwise known as MPLS in most cases, with some of these internet-type access techniques? And the answer is absolutely yes here, too. Quite an interesting balance. Now, small organizations probably are mostly using the internet-type connectivity, and so they may have a little bit less amount of turnover that they're looking to do. Medium-sized organizations is really where the bubble is, where they may or may not have the purchasing power to get good pricing on managed services, and so the alternatives start to look more attractive, and they respond at the highest rate. Large organizations oftentimes have really strict needs, and also the purchasing leverage to get good pricing on their MPLS connectivity, and therefore a little bit less interested in moving to these other models. But the takeaway is there's quite a bit of churn happening here, and this is really important, primarily because it changes the way that you monitor, it changes what you monitor, and it changes the expectations you have about what your remote connectivity is going to be able to do as part of the broader network infrastructure, and how much or if you're going to be able to provide and apply optimization technologies. That's why we like to keep an eye on this. Okay, so let's move into the first megatrend. The first megatrend is one we've been tracking for several years. It's around the impact of cloud and virtualization technology. Now, I'm sorry to include and try to incorporate both of those terms in one, but the proposition that EMA has, especially when it comes to the network, is the virtualization technologies that are relevant here, and this happens to do with virtual networking, are the same whether you're talking about internal server environments or you're talking about cloud-based environments, external cloud-based environments. It's all about virtualization, and it's all about Now, no longer having a direct handle on and touch point to physical network infrastructure, you now have to move to also understanding virtual network infrastructure. So we're starting to merge these two areas as an area to keep an eye on. First thing we asked was, tell us a little bit about pain points. And are any of these service models causing you trouble? And the takeaway here is gained by looking at the very bottom of the list. Only 1/4 of our respondents said none of these are giving us trouble. Everyone else is having some degree of pain. Now, not everyone is using each of these models, but the interesting result, I think, is that there is definitely concern and issues being had based on the use of cloud services, whether they're external or whether they're actually this transition to internal cloud that is taking place in a growing number of organizations. Then we want to dive a little deeper. And in particular, what we wanted to know is, specifically for that virtual network technology, do you have the visibility you need for monitoring and troubleshooting? And so we asked that against these various different cloud models. And the interesting result here, the way we asked this is, do you feel like you have enough? So a high response rate means people feel like they're in a good position. And you can see that actually only large organizations feel like they're in a good position with visibility in virtual networks. They at least are responding about 2/3 saying, yeah, we're good. But less than half of the small and medium-sized organizations feel like they have the visibility they need today. Now, we've been tracking this over a couple of years. The first time we asked this was a special research report we did in 2011, and we only had about 23% of folks on average saying they had sufficient visibility. We refreshed that in 2012, and we were up to about 28%. Now, I would say if we average this all out, we're a little over 50%. So things are getting better, but there's still a lot of work to do. The other question we asked, besides visibility, was a similar question but specific to control. Do you have the control you need over those virtual networks in these various settings to do the configuration controls you want and to enforce the policies that you want to have active in your network? And things are a little bit better here. They're a little bit better than the visibility side of things. Again, there's still work to do, but we also knew from our past data points in 2011, the aggregate answer for the internal data center was about 36%, and in 2012 it was 46%, and here it's just a little bit over 50. So we're making progress again, slow but steady progress, but it's still lots of room for improvement and lots of chance to do better. Okay, with that I'm going to move to number 2 megatrend, which is looking at software-defined networking, SDN, and what it means to network management. And Tracy's going to lead that off for us. Tracy.
Okay, thank you, Jim. All right, so again, I just want to reiterate, when we look at these new and emerging technologies, we are looking to see how they impact network management practices. And in this particular case, we know that there's multiple uses of SDN technology, so we narrowed it down to what we're referring to as SDN underlay, which is what we're talking about, the physical network devices, things like OpenFlow, SDN controllers, that type of SDN. And then the SDN overlay, which refers to the virtual network infrastructures. So the virtual network overlays like VMware NSX, for example. And these definitions were provided to the respondents so that they understood what we were looking for when we asked the questions. So where we wanted to start was, what is the state of SDN in the enterprise? Is it real? And what was interesting here is, now you'll see we put both underlay and overlay, so underlays in blue and overlays in green. You're not going to see a whole lot of differences between the two types of SDN here. But what is noticeable is that if you look down at 15% approximately, there's no SDN in use. Well, I think that's pretty low. I was pretty surprised, actually, to see that it was that low. So if you look at the top two lines, you'll see that about 50% are either researching or evaluating SDN technologies, with another 15% already in the testing phase. And then, believe it or not, which I was actually surprised to find deployments here, we had about 7 or 8% initial deployments fully complete and 10% that were fully complete. So, SDN is very real. Now, like Jim said earlier, it's not a top driver necessarily in the network operations, but it is very much real. It's being considered, and it has potential for much greater impact moving, in future, possibly in out in a year when more of it is adopted across the enterprise. So the next thing we did was we said, okay, for the people who are actually using this stuff, we wanted to get an idea is, are your current tools doing the job? So this is a much smaller group. There's only about 44 people, because these were the people that either initially
had finished their initial deployments or were fully deployed. And again, not a lot of difference between the overlay and underlay networks. And we asked it across all the different network management practices. And as you can see, pre-existing tools pretty much do the job. But if you look where that arrow is, you'll see that in the case of planning and engineering for overlay networks, these guys aren't really getting the job done. They're looking to separate tools possibly for doing more of that type of work around SDN. So for now, they're doing the job. But again, I think a lot of this is because we're still talking about limited deployments here. But for now, they're doing what they need to for the most part with the tools they have on hand. Then what we did was we went back, and this is back now to the full respondent set, and we wanted to get an idea for the broader impact of SDN. Like, what are some of the concerns, the issues that they have as they start to look at SDN and its broader deployment? And of course, again, no surprise there. Security comes out. It's a little bit higher for the underlay networks, but again, when you put security in the mix, it's usually always the first concern. And what I thought was really interesting was if you looked at troubleshooting, I was kind of surprised to see it, equal almost across all responses, and then yet, much lower on the list than I would have expected. But again, I think this is a real reflection of the limited set of deployments. It's not having that kind of network impact yet, and so I think over time, I think you're going to see that sort of rise up the list a little bit. And then one of the other things I looked at really quickly just to see if there was any differences in priorities was when we talked about, remember Jim talked about deployment size, the number of devices under management. Now, yes, security remains the biggest concern, but what's interesting in large deployments, capacity planning actually jumps up as a very strong number 2 contender for concern. And in smaller enterprises, in medium enterprises, it's more frequency of change is what they're concerned about. And then when you look at it by size of organization, meaning total number of employees, new training was a big concern for the small and medium enterprises. And again, this makes sense because they have a much smaller resource pool to draw from as opposed to a large enterprise where training was much farther down the list for them. And that really comes as no surprise since they have more people to draw from. And I think that's it. And it's back to Jim.
Thanks, Tracy. That's awesome. Let's move on to Megatrend number 3. And this is about big data. This was the third part of our headline, Cloud, SDN, and Big Data. And for big data, this is really sort of early stage, sort of foundational. We're trying to figure out what is big data with respect to networks and network management. Is it relevant? We had some really basic questions to ask, and we've been asking them and getting very widely different answers from folks. And so we put in some sort of foundational questions in this research, and there's only a couple of them I want to share them with you here. The first one had to do with asking whether or not big data analytics was actually having an impact on network management practices. And I will have to say I was pretty surprised that this level of response was indicated. Now, we didn't go into great detail to define what we meant by big data analytics, and I think there's a lot of confusion out there about what that means, what it is and what it isn't. A lot of network management tools vendors say, hey, we already do big data because we gather large volumes of data. So we have to go through and do some better and closer definition to make sure of what we're seeing here. But in general, the folks who participated do believe that at a pretty high rate, they're using this kind of technology to support network management. And in fact, if you look at the bottom line again down there, only 32% saying that, no, we're really not doing any type of big data analytics with respect to these core functional areas. So really interesting response, much higher than I personally expected, and means that we're going to have to do a little more digging to find out specifically what kind of analytics, what products are being used, what are the use cases? Are they specific or are they broad? Lots of follow-on questions from this. The second question we asked was, okay, so maybe you're using them to support network management products, but are you taking data out of your network management tools and then putting them into big data-like repositories? And again, the answer here actually is surprisingly high, almost 40% saying, yes, yea, verily, we are taking information from our network management systems and sending them out into a big data repository. Again, lots of questions. What kind of big data repository? Why is it being used? Which data is being grabbed? So I think we're going to have to do some follow-up to this because it's a much stronger level of engagement and activity than we were expecting. Similarly, the last question that we asked with respect to this was just a sanity check. Is big data and big data projects having an effect? Are they having an effect? Are these technologies having an effect on the network itself? In other words, Do they show up in the network monitoring systems? Do you see the results of the deployment of these technologies? And while plenty of folks, about 40% between the no changes observed and not using, basically didn't see any impact, plenty of people did see, they thought, some impact, either because it was increasing the amount of storage and backup traffic, which is certainly a big, network citizen that we all have to deal with and see on a regular basis, or the actual collection of this big data and the movement of that data into the data store being recognizable and having some impact on the behavior or performance of the network. So again, surprisingly high levels of response for these things. This means, watch this space. We're definitely going to have to dive into this much more deeply as we go ahead and figure out the real story of big data versus the network. Okay, Megatrend 4. So here we're going to talk about some changes in the composition and approach that are taking place. And in particular, what we see is a real rise in the use of log data and APIs as part of network management tools and practices. So I'm going to start with a general question that we have typically asked over the years to understand what types of features in management tools are having the greatest impact and add the greatest value. Now, this is a little bit simpler. We had a much longer list in the 2012 research, so it's hard to put them side by side. But we included a bunch of capabilities. Log file analysis, I'm going to be honest, doesn't necessarily belong on this list. It kind of is different from the others. But we left it in here because we saw an emergence and a high-level response against log file analysis last time we did this research, and we wanted to verify whether or not that was still the case. And absolutely, it came out on top again in this list of valued feature capabilities. The interesting thing here is that the others are quite consistent. In 2012, the top three were log file analysis, reporting, and support for virtual servers. And sure enough, that's what we have again right here. There's been a slight difference in the order by staff versus executives from year to year. But the bottom line is these are pretty consistent in terms of driving and delivering the most value. These are the things that folks need most commonly. The next thing we did was to start asking about some detailed questions. The first time we've asked this set of questions. What sources of data are you using today in order to support availability and performance monitoring? We'll look at some of the other functional areas next, but we started with this, availability and performance monitoring, and we're astounded to see log files being used by so many people for these purposes. So regardless of the size of the managed environment, everybody's using log files for monitoring purposes. There is a real interesting difference here in the management system APIs use. That came in number 2 overall, but you can see that's driven largely by folks who are in large managed environments. In small and medium, not so much a big deal. The other general thing I want to point out is that, in general, medium and large-sized managed environments tend to draw from a lot more sources than smaller managed environments. You can see the blue bars really drop off pretty rapidly as you go down this list, whereas the green and yellow bars stay high, at 40%-ish at least or more for almost the entire list. So generally speaking, the bigger your managed environment, the more types of data you're going to need to pull. By the way, EMA advocates to try to include as many data sources as possible because in reality, many times, you don't know which viewpoint's going to give you the information you need to get to the bottom of a problem. It's best to incorporate as many as you can, practically and affordably, of course. So the next thing we looked at was availability performance monitoring. Then we also wanted to look at capacity planning to find out, for capacity planning purposes, which data sources are you turning to. And again, log files and APIs come out, number 1 and number 2. Surprising. I didn't know that there were use cases that were for log files to drive planning and engineering, but there is, and we're going to have to dive into this a little deeper too. But log files and APIs came out on top. Again, we see this variation here between managed environment size, where smaller environments drops off pretty quick after log files and APIs. But large and medium, definitely using a lot more sources in general. And large organizations, by the way, using NetFlow quite heavily, in fact, even more than management system APIs. Little difference, but by the way, I want to point out this difference between packet inspection and NetFlow between medium and large-sized managed environments. Packet inspection is typically a more comprehensive viewpoint than what you get with NetFlow, although we could have the discussion about whether or not that's changing. I think there's an interesting indication here, though, that there's a peak point where medium-sized organizations are going to rely on it very heavily. But in order to cover a very large distributed environment, the larger organizations are they're still using packet inspection, but they're also turning increasingly towards NetFlow as a source that is perhaps more scalable and more cost-effective over very, very large distributed environments. Exceptions will apply, of course. Okay, and then the last area that we looked at was for data sources was for troubleshooting. What sort of data sources do you turn to when it comes to troubleshooting? And once again, here we are, log files come out on top. Clear and away. Now, there wasn't nearly as much variation between organization size on this one or managed environment size. We're just showing the averages. I will say this is a question, we asked a very similar question in 2012. And in 2012, the top four were log files, still, network configuration info, traffic volume, and this could be either NetFlow or it could be packet capture and analysis. So number 3 is still sort of similar to the number 3 we see here. And then number 4 last time was packet analysis. So it was a slightly different list. And what we tried to do, I should point out, in 2012, what we asked, one of the choices was log files and other statistics. And we wanted to split that because that was too broad of an answer. We wanted to see, is it log files or is it other statistics, things like SNMP data collection? And the answer to that question was log files, not so much the SNMP data. So some interesting findings here. And we're going to dive into this in more detail. Actually, EMA has calendared right now a deeper research study coming up this quarter on log file analysis for operations monitoring and support, where in particular we're going to dive into this kind of information, try to figure out the actual use cases, what sources of log data are being used, how is it being used, what work tasks are being met with this. So more to come on this one as well. Last point here on this changing data sources. One of the things that Tracy and I keep running across and have noticed in the managed environment is the growing number of APIs. It's just exploding number of APIs as management interfaces. We saw the results a few slides earlier on how they're changing the way that data is being pulled and used for management. So the question is, what does that do to the engineering and operations team? What does it mean from a skills perspective? And the answer is, everybody's out there having to learn scripting, programming, some combination thereof. Either they've had to go start doing that now, or they're planning to. If you look at the bottom 2 bars there, only less than 20% are saying no, we don't have to deal with this. That means 82% are. So this is a major change in the skills requirements for what's out there to be dealt with in the network and for managing networks. All right, the last megatrend I want to talk about here is something we've been tracking also for some time. It's around convergence in the network operations teams and the tools that they're using. So the first question we asked here, and this is a brand new question for us in this study, was what sort of organization are you using around network operations? We talked to plenty of folks and seen a growing number of organizations on a broader EMA perspective that are moving to this cross-domain service-oriented operations model. And what we have here was about an average of 40% said yes. And that's the highest EMA has seen in any study we've done to date. We have tracked it, generally speaking, and measured it a number of different ways. But about 2009, we had a snapshot that said we were probably at about 18 to 20% of organizations using this model. Back in about 2012, we thought we had some data that pointed to 2 in the low 30%. And this at 40% is the highest level of response we've seen. So it's quite interesting. It's quite a strong result. It's a trend that we think is continuing. It has also implications and is driven in part by shifts to cloud models, to internal cloud, to internal IT as a service. All of these things push organizations in this direction. One little interesting side note, one of the folks I was talking to about their input has done this, and I asked them, well, what do you call it? Do you call it the Integrated Operations Center, the Service Operations Center? What do you call it? And his answer was, well, we call it the NOC, which was really interesting because it's no longer just the NOC, even though that might be the name being used. It was, as he described it to me, truly an integrated cross-domain team where they had server, storage, network, and application teams and security teams all in the same room, all working together. So we really believe that is a model that's going to be continuing to grow over time. A parallel to this, and part of those drivers that we see, is increased awareness and focus within the networking team and the network management team here in this question to some of these higher level functions, these higher level capabilities. And so this was a really very sort of heartwarming thing to see that we had 2/3 of folks who are calling out service quality as something they are increasingly aware of and are important to them from a network management perspective. Other similar measures, things like end user experience and application performance, all was very closely related, similar types of measures, and all at more than 50%. So this is a good thing to see, and this is part of what drives organizations towards those integrated models and drives them away from independent and non-structured siloed tool approaches. In fact, along those lines, we asked for the second time, what strategy do you prefer to take when acquiring and deploying your products, your management products? And we're showing the split by organization size. And the number one answer, as it was 2 years ago, continues to be fully integrated multifunction platforms. Now, EMA describes those oftentimes as unified platforms, meaning you have one product and it can do multiple network management functions. A close second to that is the concept of tightly integrated best of suite. Now, many times this is manifested as a bundle that you would get from a management tools provider who has covered all of the different functional spaces, but they are modular products. They actually install separately, but then they are integrated on the back end. So that's not too far removed. But the interesting thing here is the character of responses to this question is really very, very similar to the character of responses we saw in the integrated operations question a few slides ago. And again, there's a little variation here by organization size where the smaller organizations probably have a handle on this without having to go to a fully integrated platform. Medium-sized organization is a real sweet spot for this. They really see the value of that. Large organizations may have trouble with making a fully integrated platform scale to their needs and therefore are much more likely to choose the second one here or are more likely to choose it than others, that being a tightly integrated approach. So some interesting responses, something we're going to track over time, but in general, this continues to be the preferred technique and approach and strategy for buying and deploying tools. Okay, the last section here is a few thoughts and findings around network management requirements in general. I want to start with, we asked a couple questions, a list of 10 each, around what kind of features are you getting the most value out of for availability monitoring and for performance monitoring. And here's the top 5. Availability monitoring, things like some automation, management of alarms, correlation, trending, good stuff there. From a performance monitoring perspective, traffic volume flow analysis came out on top, followed by trending. Response time analysis is actually an interesting one because it ties closely to one of those measures we had a few slides ago. We talked about the increasing interest in an end-user experience as one of the higher-level objectives. Well, one of the key ways to judge that from a network perspective is to do response time analysis. Packet analysis is still very, very important for performance monitoring. And route analytics actually showed up as number 5 in the top 5 here. I have to say that that was driven largely by responses from very large managed environment folks, where they will have a significant routed portion of their network. They'll have their own routing going on, and they can get value out of detailed route analytics. Smaller organizations, on the other hand, tend to have mostly switch networks. They're not dealing with the same kind of sets of challenges that require route analytics. But it's still very popular, and it's still adding a lot of value, especially in the large shops. The next thing I want to focus on in a little more detail was a similar question we asked with respect to network change and configuration management. Now, I want to call your attention very quickly to the very small text in the lower left that says sample size 164. So only 2/3 of the folks that participated said that they had some responsibility or exposure to network NCCM, network change and configuration management, in the first place. So we didn't ask this of everybody. We first made sure that folks had some sense for what these tools did. So first off, I will say that the fact that only 2/3 of respondents did say, yes, we have these, was a little bit shocking. I thought that there was broader usage for these. But then very interestingly, in terms of the folks that did then answer this question, the levels of response are really pretty astounding and pretty heartwarming. I'm going to use that term again here, in large part because so much value is being received. If you look at the average responses here for almost everything except the bottom two, the average response is 50% or above. And that means that people are picking 2, 3, or 4 of these features that they're getting value out of. And if I compare, and I don't have the numbers in front of you here, but there was nowhere near this level of response for the availability monitoring or the performance monitoring sort of choices. So very strong value verification for these tools. And in particular, I want to point out the yellow bars, which is the very large managed environments. Those environments in particular are everything. They answer to every one of these as 50% or better. And they tended to choose 4 or 5 of these choices. So the takeaway is in very large environments, the NCCM tools can deliver a tremendous amount of value. And if you're not using them today, take a hard look at this list and realize that folks that deploy them are seeing a lot of return on their investment, and you should think about it yourself. Last point I want to show here is a check that we're doing on the use of SaaS, Software as a Service, as a technique for accessing and delivering network management products. Now, this is the second year we asked this question as well. And the interesting thing is we have very, very similar responses, slightly higher than we had in 2012. But the takeaway here is that only a small percentage, about 1 in 5, in those bottom 2 questions, would never use or really don't understand SaaS models for network management, and therefore have no interest in them. But that means 80% of folks are. Either they're using them now in some or an extended manner, or they're looking into them. So SaaS is something that there's a lot of shops that still have not been interested in trying this. However, there's a growing number of organizations, network management tools companies, that are offering SaaS-based network management solutions. And it's something that we'll keep a close eye on because we believe this is an important alternative model and actually a lower cost of ownership model to access network management technology that's growing in acceptance sort of in parallel with SaaS in general and the maturity of cloud services. Okay, so let's move into the wrap-up here so we can get a few minutes left for some Q&A. So first off, thanks for joining us. I hope you heard some of these things. There's lots of good little tidbits in here. Here's the ones I hope you take away. First off, based on the current snapshot, EMAs feels like there's, in many cases, still far too many tools being used to be efficient and effective. We still have a lot of work to do around cloud and virtualization, especially when it comes down to network management in those environments. SDN, it's still early days, very early days. But I will say that the network management experiences for those who have done deployments indicate that it might not be as bad as we thought in terms of disruption to network management practices. Big data, we have some early info here that says there is definitely an impact on tools and networks. We are going to have to go do some more diving into that. Log file and APIs, boy, they are continuing to be more and more important. The predominance of log files as a data source across multiple network management use cases means that if you're not really leveraging this data source today, you ought to be looking at it. And the big challenge will be how do you do that on an integrated basis instead of on a standalone basis. Network operations, we're going to keep tracking this convergence activity. We see this convergence in the organization side of things. That we need to understand the impact that's going to have on tools and practices. Finally, NCCM, definitely high value, especially in those large shops. And SaaS, I think you're going to hear more and more about SaaS-based offerings in the coming months and years. And it clearly is something that's worth taking a look at. If you haven't yet and you're looking at reevaluating your tools, consider that as a way to gain access to your network management technology. So with that, I'm going to turn back to Raleigh. Raleigh, do we have some questions that have come up that we can address?
Yes, we do, Jim. Jumping right into it. The first question is regarding, at the beginning of your presentation, you had discussed network devices, and this audience member wanted to know, how are you defining that? Simply a router or switch or anything attached to the network?
Excellent question, and we were very specific in the way we asked that question. We wanted network devices, switches, routers, anything that's in line in the network but is a network-based function, but not, and specifically we excluded endpoint-attached devices and servers. So that's what we were after, was the actual managed, the network devices themselves.
Great, thanks for that clarification. Moving on to the next question. This audience member wants to know, did you touch on any storage network monitoring trends in your research, or can you speak to that at all?
And not specific to storage. Now, we asked a few questions in here that had to do with, do you see storage as an important, part of the managed environment? It did show up in a few places, for instance, in the root cause analysis. But no, there's a whole separate area that would be very specific and narrow to, for instance, fiber channel network monitoring. That's not really the scope of this, and it wasn't specific to this.
Great, thank you. Let's take one final question. Do you think pre-existing tools really can support SDN technologies?
Well, this is Tracy. Oh, go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, Tracy. I was going to say, Tracy, what do you think about that?
Oh. Well, I think I have to say I was very interested to see that such a strong response for current tools, supporting the folks that actually had SDN in place and were making use of things, and some things that we do know that, existing tools can do today to help out with SDN technologies are things like packet monitoring. It can support decapsulation of overlay traffic, so you have visibility into that. You can availability tools can monitor health and activity of open flow controllers, and flow monitoring tools can collect net flow from virtual overlay networks. So there's things that we know today that will help support SDN. I do believe over time, though, there's so much going on with APIs and the connectivity of, so many touch points of using APIs to connect to the physical and virtual worlds that I think we're probably going to have to expand. I think the existing tools will have to expand to better understand those touch points and how to monitor them. I just don't think we're there yet, and I think that that's one thing that's going to have to change over time. Will it be new tools, or will the existing tools incorporate that? I think it's going to be a little bit of both, depending on, what kind of capabilities we're going to be looking for moving forward. We won't know that till we get this stuff. As always, right, network troubleshooting always comes after the fact. So when we start to have problems, then we'll figure out ways to troubleshoot them.
Great. Thanks, Tracy. Jim, did you have anything to add to that before we conclude today's event?
No, I think she covered it pretty well.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jim and Tracy, and I wanted to thank our audience for taking time out of your day to join us. As I mentioned at the start of the event, you will be receiving a follow-up email from Enterprise Management Associates tomorrow that will include the playback of this event. Thanks again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.